On this episode of New Mexico Now, we'll discuss what the election of Donald Trump as president may mean for New Mexico, and we'll preview the upcoming legislative session. This is New Mexico Now. Thank you for joining us for another episode of New Mexico Now. I'm Anthony Moreno. Joining us in studio to talk about the top issues facing our state is Walt Rubel from the Las Cruces Sun-News and Lauren Villagran from the Albuquerque Journal. Thank you so much for being here. As we know, with the election of Donald Trump as president, we're going to take a look at the impact that election of Donald Trump could have on the state of New Mexico. I'd like to start off during the campaign. Donald Trump talked about how he was going after sanctuary cities. And I want to kick off this conversation talking about how that could have an impact on communities like Las Cruces.
Well, and for Las Cruces, the issue is more the county than the city. The city doesn't really have laws in place like Santa Fe does, for example, where they have officially declared themselves a sanctuary city. We don't have that here. But the county has done a couple of things that may make it a sanctuary city. I mean, there is no hard and fast definition, so it's hard to say. But we no longer will hold ICE detainees in our jail. We did that for quite a while, and my understanding is that there's supposed to be a 2-day hold, and they weren't coming to pick them up, and so people were staying in there for weeks on what should have been a 2-day hold. And so the county ended up getting sued, and as a result of that lawsuit, they just don't do that anymore. They said, we're not going to take any more detention holds from immigration. And they've also instructed the sheriffs not to ask those kinds of questions when they pull people over. But as we know, the sheriff is an independently elected official, and so, the sheriff makes that decision himself. But both Todd Garrison and Kiki Vigil have had the same policy on that they don't ask those questions. And so I think we're in a little bit of a gray area that in some way we could be considered a sanctuary city, and President-elect Trump has threatened to take federal money from cities that are sanctuary cities. So whether we qualify for that or not, I'm not sure. And NMSU has had an issue with that as well.
Hey, you bring up a good point. I mean, Lauren, this obviously, Walt talked about gray area. Obviously, we're pretty familiar with living in a gray area here in the borderland. New Mexico State University obviously took a stance on this issue recently.
So there's a group at NMSU that was pushing for Chancellor Gary Carruthers to declare campus a sanctuary campus with everything that would mean. And their petition included things like assuring that undocumented students had a place at the university, and actually forbidding U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, from getting on campus. Chancellor Carruthers came out with a pretty strong statement saying that he would not declare the university a quote-unquote sanctuary campus. That being said, the state of New Mexico already has a lot of laws in place that protect immigrants who are undocumented, both students who may be recipients of the executive order DACA, but others as well. And there's actually a lot in place that sort of makes NMSU a sanctuary for people who may not have legal paperwork. But I think Chancellor Carruthers wanted to walk a fine line and not kind of call attention to campus or risk any kind of funding. And the idea of keeping ICE agents off campus, which I'm not sure that there's any incidents or history of ICE agents raiding campus, is a difficult one. I mean, how would you go about doing that? And you wouldn't want to keep federal law enforcement broadly off campus because things happen.
And most of what they were asking for, Carruthers said we're already doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, does that make an impact already, though? I mean, New Mexico State University does have a police department. So does that have an impact on how they're going to operate as well?
Well, and that's one of the interesting things, even at the county level, is there is, because we're on the border, a lot of cooperation. There's the high-intensity drug task force, and there's the Stone Garden, Operation Stone Garden, where they get federal funding to help out with things like human trafficking and drug interdiction. So there's a lot of cooperation already between federal agents and the NMSU police and the county sheriffs. And so the idea that they're just not going to ever interact with each other, I think that's a little bit, we're just so, everything we do is so connected with what happens on the border here that I just think that sort of defies reality, that we're going to bar them from campus. And
yeah, I think for advocates, one of the important things with the interaction with federal law enforcement is not to give the community the sense that if you have a domestic violence incident at home, that if you call the police, you're at risk of deportation. I mean, they want to draw enough of a line so that people who may not be living in the country legally still feel comfortable calling law enforcement when there's an issue, when there's domestic violence, when there's a drug concern. And so, Las Cruces Police Department and the Sheriff's Office have said, we're not going to call Border Patrol at every traffic stop when we think that you might be undocumented. Of course, the driver's license issue plays into this. Right. But yeah, it remains to be seen. I mean, President-elect Trump has said we're going to take away federal funding for so-called sanctuary cities, but what does that mean? How is there a quote-unquote official declaration?
Yeah.
There are cities that have officially declared themselves, but there's no criteria for what that really means.
I guess more concerning to me is, could you envision some kind of edict or some kind of order where local law enforcement would be told that they have to start enforcing immigration laws and have to start asking these questions? That you're exactly right. I mean, when you're going to a domestic violence call, the last thing you want is the person who is getting beaten to be afraid to call the police, and so that's what I'm concerned about more than taking money away, is would there be some kind of attempt to tell local law enforcement how they would have to handle those situations?
Well, the New Mexico Association of Counties has come out with a pretty strong stance on this, in terms of what they recommend for the way that counties operate both law enforcement, jails, and the county structure, because there have been cases that have gone all the way to appellate courts that have said, you as a county, you can't hold people, for example, on an ICE detainer when there are no charges, when there isn't a warrant. If a person has committed a crime or is here illegally, get a warrant. That's all it's said. It hasn't said, like, don't detain illegal, people who may be here illegally. So, the president has a certain amount of power, and obviously the rhetoric that he uses and the policies that he may push through Congress could have a trickle-down effect here. But the courts have already looked at some of these issues, and so counties and cities need to protect themselves from civil litigation and not trample on the rights of both U.S. citizens, legal residents, and those who are here illegally. So, yeah.
I mean, I want to continue on that a little bit. I mean, you talked about rhetoric. I mean, we've seen already since the election of Donald Trump as president, him just saying that, Air Force One was too expensive and how that impacted Boeing. I mean, the words of a president do matter. And, moving on to one of the issues being trade, Donald Trump on the campaign trail talked about NAFTA being, the worst thing ever signed, worst trade deal maybe ever signed ever. That's what he said. And so how do words like that impact business and trade along here, that on the border where we live every day? I mean, how are folks on the border that are involved with trade, getting prepared? I mean, there has to be a lot of uneasiness when people say things like that.
Yeah, uneasiness is probably the way to describe it. So one thing I hear, first of all, that needs to be made very clear is, just because President-elect Trump says let's undo NAFTA, it simply cannot be undone at the stroke of a pen, an executive order, nothing like that. It's an international agreement. It would require months, probably years, at a negotiating table before anything would be done. But again, rhetoric is important. So what does that mean for a place like Santa Teresa, where they're trying to recruit companies? Or what does that mean for a place like Juarez that is constantly seeing new U.S. and other global players come to town to manufacture? And the warehousing and logistics businesses that you see popping up in Santa Teresa are based on that growth in Mexico. So I have reached out to some business people in the area, and and also the developers in the area, and that was exactly the question I had: is this chilling the market? Are people taking a wait-and-see approach? And I got a range of answers, and what I heard was, one, yes, anytime there's a political transition, there's kind of a quiet period where people aren't making big decisions. But there's this added element that the wait and see period could go on longer than usual, not just the 3 months till inauguration, but maybe 6 months, 9 months, because I don't think anyone wants to call attention to themselves. I mean, you saw what happened with Carrier, you saw what happened with Boeing. Whatever the president-elect says has an immediate and huge impact, and if he's going to go out on Twitter and call attention to or possibly bully corporations that are looking to move jobs to Mexico, I think you are going to see executives step back and say, let's just not stick our heads out just now, let's sit tight. Yeah, I know there are deals in the pipeline, but yeah, that's what I heard.
Well, we just only have like a couple minutes left on this topic, but I mean, speaking of people who aren't waiting and just seeing what happened, Mexico. I mean, we're talking about, you know, one of our biggest trade partners here, and they're not just sitting there idle. I mean, what do you know as far as that goes? I mean, with people on the Mexican side of the border, and what their thoughts are on this.
Well, I mean, I think there's real fear about the economic impact, which, incidentally, you know, Walt and I were speaking about this, that anything that that our government does that hurts the Mexican economy is going to probably come back to bite us in pretty serious ways. U.S. pension funds are heavily invested in Mexico. If the Mexican economy goes down the tubes for whatever reason that it might be, you're going to see increased illegal migration northward, which has for the past 5 or 6 years, I mean, almost come to a standstill for Mexico. The peso has crashed. It was about 10 to the dollar. It's now almost 20 to the dollar, so that has huge impact on the Mexican consumer. I mean, it's just an incredible range of reactions. And I know the day after the election that there was a big meeting of the Conservative National Action Party in Mexico, in Mexico City. I know someone who was there, and it was maybe it was a massive freak out of like, what do we do now? And nobody knows what's going to happen, because President-elect Trump has walked back some of his toughest rhetoric. I mean, I don't know what you see, Walt, but you know.
Nobody knows what's going to happen. I think that's the key. I think that, you know, he has said so many things. And as Lauren said, it's not like he can just go in and undo these trade pacts that have been in place for years, that have binding contracts, that you can't just go in and unravel all that overnight.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll definitely see how that's going to unfold. We're going to move on now. As we know, the state of New Mexico is facing a budget crisis, with Democrats taking control of both the House and Senate in this past election. There is going to be some needed bipartisan work with Republican Governor Susana Martinez in order for the state to address the crisis. In fact, recently, State Senator John Arthur Smith, chair of the Legislative Finance Committee, called for a bipartisan effort to meet this challenge. Smith, in a recent commentary to New Mexico, or politics.net, said that New Mexico has never been in a state of luxury or indulgence with the politically influenced special session resulting in only Band-Aid solutions. And with no way to solve these problems quickly, lawmakers will be forced to scramble through another solvency plan during the regular legislative session in January. Smith continues in his commentary by saying that New Mexico public officials should resolve for the new year to also work together on a bipartisan plan to solve this budget crisis and put New Mexico on sound financial footing for the future. He said that earlier this month in a commentary. Walt, I mean, are we moving into an age of where we probably will see some Band-Aid solutions in the upcoming legislative sessions?
We're almost out of Band-Aids. That's what we did in the special session, was we did Band-Aid solutions. The last year's regular session, we swept all of the reserve funds that we could. All of the low-hanging fruit has been picked. All of the middle-hanging fruit has been picked, and you know, we're left with the stuff that's up at the top of the tree. We're at a position now where public defenders, you know, aren't able to take cases to court. John Arthur Smith, in that same meeting, essentially signaled to school districts to expect big cuts to come. We know that the university system is going to take more cuts. I mean, the last revenue projection, every quarter they come out with a new projection for the state, and the last one was down another $134 million. Every time they come out with a new one, it's down. I mean, we are so tied to oil and gas revenue, and until that bounces back, I just don't know what the solution is. And I chuckle a little bit when John Arthur Smith goes on and on about bipartisan solutions. What he's talking about is some form of revenue increase, whether that's taxes or fees or however it comes. He's looking for some way. Yes, we're going to have to continue to cut spending, but he is looking for some way to bring in more revenue. And the governor has dug in her heels, and she's going to try to make it, I think, 2 more years without doing that. And so that is, I think, where the tug of war is going to come.
Well, Chancellor Carruthers said he expects another 1.5% to 2% reduction in higher education funding. The school's already cut tens of millions of dollars over the last 2 years. It's part of its restructuring effort, and in the special session, higher education took a 5% cut. So everybody's scrambling.
Yeah.
Where is, I mean, obviously the governor has drawn the line, hey, no new taxes.
Right.
And so, I mean, where is any possibility, for what you know, of actually something happening to where we could either, bring in some sort of revenue?
Well, when Bill Richardson was governor, one of the first things he did was pass a massive tax cut. And we are paying for that now. But the other thing he did was he nickeled and dimed, that he started raising fees all over the place. And by the time he got done, they were bringing in, I think, about as much revenue as they were before that huge tax cut. And so there are ways that you can do that. You can increase, costs for services, for licenses, for fees, that kind of thing. The museums are all starting to shut down now. Maybe they start charging a little bit more to get in. I mean, you can only go so far with that kind of stuff. I think, to really get to where they want to go, they're going to have to look at, I know John Arthur Smith was trying to put through some kind of gas tax that would at least pay for the road improvements. I mean, I think and now that, like you say, they have changed and the House is now in the hands of Democrats, I'm certain that those proposals will come out of the legislature. I'm just not sure that the governor will sign any of them.
Well, I want to bring up a recent commentary that Carter Bundy, political director, legislative director with ASME, State Employee Union, recently wrote in a commentary in NewMexicoPolitics.net. He talked about taxing internet sales. He talked about healthcare assessment fees, freezing the corporate tax cuts that are in place, and taxes on sin taxes. And also he brought up, of course, which I imagine we will hear in the next legislative session, the legalization of recreational use of marijuana and regulating that and taxing that as well. I'm curious, do you see any of these things actually being possible with any type of movement? Is this something that it isn't going to cause a big commotion across either side of the aisle?
Well, I think, like I said, I think a lot of that will get through the legislature. I don't think the marijuana bill will. Bill McCamley and I think others will push for it, but I might be wrong. I just don't think it's there yet, and certainly the governor would not sign that. I mean, she's a career prosecutor. She's made her opinion on that pretty well known.
I feel like the elephant in the room, and something that just can't be addressed by the legislature in a single session, is economic development. I mean, when you think about, I have only been in New Mexico for 3 years, but it's the 3 years that has seen the crash in the oil prices and in the oil fields. And I went out to Hobbs, and when you go out to this kind of tiny corner of the state and you realize the immense impact that it has on the whole state, it's not sustainable in the long run. There has to be economic development, and that has been a priority of the governor, but I don't think anything's quite worked out as planned. I mean, the economy must be diversified, otherwise this is just, I guess, a perennial thing, because oil prices will come back up, but they will go back down. And when you're out in a place like Hobbs, it's a tiny town. I was there, when all of the oil folks had really left. And you see the pump jacks going and these immense fields, but there were no rigs. There were maybe a dozen rigs where there had been more than 100 a year before. And the rigs are what bring the jobs, and the rigs are where the investment is. And I don't see how the whole state can operate on the back of one industry. I mean, it just, so that's a much longer term question that is beyond just sort of the revenue and taxation question that I think as we move towards the election, the governor's election in 2 years from now, right? Should be something that's probably going to be on the table.
And everybody understands that.
Yeah.
The idea that we are so tied to gas and oil, and federal government as well. I mean, those two things, we are so dependent. And that's why, you know, the spaceport is something that I was so optimistic, and still am. I mean, I haven't given up on it, but I think those are the kinds of things that we need, because we've been doing it the same way forever, and we're in trouble.
Well, I mean, the spaceport, you know, obviously is going to be something in this next legislative session that is going to need some funding if it wants to continue on its mission of what they're trying to do out there.
Yeah.
I mean, are they somebody that could be on the chopping block?
They certainly could. And Dan Hicks, the new CEO, was up in Santa Fe last month, I think, within the last few weeks, making his case. And you have to understand that there are lawmakers up there. George Munoz from Gallup has introduced 2 bills already saying, let's just get rid of this thing. And if I'm representing Gallup, I would probably feel the same way. It hasn't had the payoff that they were promised, that we all were promised would happen by now. I mean, that's nobody's fault.
It's really part of the commercial space industry.
Yeah.
So I had the opportunity to speak with Dan Hicks, and he's very well connected. He ran a big chunk of Wismar as a civilian executive for many, many years. But the commercial space industry, it's not just that the spaceport hasn't taken off. The commercial space industry has been emerging much slower than anybody expected. So there isn't even a large pool of companies to recruit from yet, because many are still in the technology development stage, the venture capital stage. And so, you know, we'll see what happens, but it might be a 5 to 10 year time frame, not a 2 to 3 year time frame. And to kind of bring the conversation back full circle, NAFTA, when you look at where the growth potential is for New Mexico, all of our other neighbor border states do infinitely more business with Mexico than we do. You've seen exports from New Mexico growing, doubling a couple of years ago. They're over $1 billion now. Texas is more like $100 billion, but we don't need to compare ourselves to Texas. But there is a lot of potential there. And so if a renegotiation of NAFTA went forward, I think New Mexico is going to want to be at the table to say, you know, what's the best possible trade agreement for a border state like ours.
I mean, you bring up a good point, obviously, but is the development that we have in Santa Teresa, I mean, they're going to want to depend on funding, I would imagine, as well, to keep up with the infrastructure needs if they want to grow that place.
Yeah, so I spoke with folks in Santa Teresa. They still have the $8.2 million in capital outlay from last year. That is coming from a pot of money that probably can't be touched because of it's not from the general fund anymore. So they're secure in getting that money to repair some roads down there that are in bad need. They are not going to be asking for any. My understanding is that the Border Industrial Association is not going to be asking for any money at this session.
And they did just get that federal grant for the airport out there as well.
Right,
so.
they also have another $1.8 million for a well. So they're sitting on a little pot of money to work up infrastructure, and they're not going to have their hand out at the session this year.
And I mean, how much does water play a role in economic development? You know, when we're talking about, I mean, another issue that is obviously on the minds of many people.
Yeah.
I know you've covered that.
Yeah, no, water in the desert. I mean, it's everything. What I hear from folks out there is that the development in Santa Teresa has been so slow and so measured over the past 20 years that they feel very secure in their resource. That resource is a cross-border aquifer, and there are no international treaties that govern groundwater. I don't know if a lot of people know this. Every single drop of the Rio Grande is accounted for and allocated, but the water underneath the surface is not. So I think that there are going to be concerns going forward in terms of water use on the Mexican side, water use in El Paso. We're all tied together. But the Santa Teresa business developers feel confident that they've got the resources to develop at the pace at which they're developing. It's not a boom town down there. Things are going pretty slowly and steadily.
It's just in comparison to the rest of the state, it kind of looks like a boom town.
That's fair. There are 3 new businesses in the newest industrial park there, that's all in the last year.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, and also with the legislative session coming up. I mean, there's obviously going to be a lot of work needed to be done. I'm just curious, I mean, should we be surprised if we can't get a deal done on the budget by the end of this legislative session, or is it going to be kicked down the road?
The reason I have a hard time answering that is just I don't have a good grasp of, after 6 years, I don't have a good grasp of the governor and how she works and how her staff works. Tom Clifford, who was her top guy on finance and budget, has retired, and so I don't know the new people who are in there running things. Like I said, with Democrats in charge now, and also with Peter Worth, I think that he has taken over for Michael Sanchez, who has been the minority leader forever. I came here in 2002, and he had been there for quite a while when I got there. He lost in the last election, and the governor spent a lot of money to defeat him. So she gets a new majority leader. It will be Peter Worth from Santa Fe, and he is less confrontational. He is, mild-mannered. He's soft-spoken, all those kinds of things. But the Democrats do have control of both chambers, and so they will put out whatever it is that they want to put out. Whether any of that goes through with the governor's blessing or not, I just don't know. And whether we're back to the days where she's vetoing, 70, 80, 90 bills a session, we very well may be.
In terms of that commitment, I think my colleagues, or maybe it was the Associated Press, reported that John Arthur Smith and some of the financial committee members are meeting in advance of the session already. I mean, I think it seems to me that there is a strong commitment on both sides of the aisle that something has to get done. I don't see this as a situation where the can be kicked down the road, right?
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. Constitutionally, that is one thing that makes us different than the federal government is
we can't
run a deficit.
We got to wrap it up. We're out of time. I want to thank you both. Thanks to Walt Rubel, Las Cruces Sun News, and Lauren Villagran from the Albuquerque Journal. Remember that you can always visit us at krwg.org to get the latest news. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at krwg for the latest news and programming announcements. Also, we would love to hear your story ideas and topics for this program. Email us at feedback@nmsu.edu.